Good afternoon. I'm Lucanio Kalata. Welcome to this first ever online elections discussion. We're streaming to you live on the SABC's YouTube channel. Thank you for being part of yet another historic moment just a day after the SABC marked its 80th anniversary. I'm joined in studio by analysts Professor Fanny Kluter and Doctors Colette Hatzenberg and Zweli Ndevu. For the next 30 minutes or so, we will discuss, unpack and hopefully give you some perspective on these 2016 local government elections. So here are the numbers, particularly for the Western Cape. For the first time ever, over 3 million people registered to vote in the province. 66 parties will contest the elections, resulting in the longest ballot paper in the country. Add to that the fact that 33 different parties will compete just for the city of Cape Town Metro alone. Let me now bring in our analysts. Firstly, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for being part of this historic discussion.
Hello.
If I can start, Prof, if I can start with you. Yesterday we discussed the issue of party ties. We now know that 66 parties will compete for positions in the Western Cape. Isn't that a little bit too much?
It's a lot of parties, sure. And many of those smaller parties are probably based around their new leaders. So I regard them as cult parties that probably do not have a right to existence in the absence of the leader and maybe one or two of his lieutenants. So it will unfortunately also fragment the final vote, and it might cause an unfortunate degree of instability after the election when no single party might in some cases have a majority and then have to rely on coalitions. And as we have seen in the past, these coalitions can be very volatile and very fragile in many cases.
Right. If I can bring in Dr. Hatzenberg, on a national level, the Western Cape is unique in the sense, firstly, that it's got 66 parties. On a national level, which other province even comes close to what we are doing down here in the Western Cape?
Well, there are a number of spread of small parties across many municipalities and in many districts in South Africa. And of course, the point about a local election is that these small parties often capture a very small constituency but can speak to issues on the ground. So local elections are enormously different to national and even provincial elections, where I would argue that small parties perhaps play an important community role. They're vocalizing particular needs and interests and opinions at a very grassroots level. The other argument, of course, against having a proliferation of small parties, as Prof has said, is that it does tend to fragment the opposition's vote, but more on a provincial and national level. And in fact, we've seen the opposite trend occur over the last 10 years in South African politics, where small parties are getting less and less percentage of the vote as opposition voters move towards the bigger parties and are beginning to what we call consolidate opposition in South Africa. So in fact, where I would argue there's probably space for small parties at the local grassroots level that reflect those particular issues, perhaps at provincial and national level, they can create that fragmentation that we do worry about in a dominant party system like South Africa.
Dr. Nev, there's talk in some circles that maybe the structure is too open. Just everybody can then come, and if you can afford the few thousand rand, you can register a party and you can compete. Do you share the sentiment that maybe the bar should be increased a little bit, just to make sure that we aren't sitting with issues of fragmentation?
I think the biggest issue is that people want representation, direct representation, and the local government, when they see that the big parties are not representing their views, they are going to definitely look for alternatives. In the Western Cape, there is a historical perspective to this issue of more smaller parties, because in many municipalities it became key makers. So everybody thinks that if he goes, or if he's a leader that is popular and can be able to capture a certain segment, then he's likely to play a bigger role within the municipality. So the fact that you have a number of municipalities that are collusions in the Western Cape with smaller parties, that gives fertile ground to those smaller parties growing up or emerging again all over and over again. But of course, the point that is raised earlier on, the fact that you now have challenges in terms of stability and all of that, we have seen that in Oudtshoorn, for example, and Stellenbosch, and we've seen in a number of municipalities where there were instabilities because the issue is not ideology. The issue is not policy-based. In terms of them, it's personalities. The leaders that are popular, or the parties exist because of those leaders, and that can create a lot of challenges.
You've now all touched on it, the issue of personality within politics. How big a deciding factor is that likely to be? Prof, let me start with you.
It can be very important in principle. Normally, one finds that votes are cast on the basis of party affiliation. But in cases where issues become important, like no toilets, no houses, potholes in the streets, and so on, no water, electricity, then the frustrations of the people who are experiencing these problems from day to day can be so great that it might supersede the party affiliation, and then they might tend to go for whomever can persuade them that they will give them better service, or it might be that they just identify themselves with a charismatic leader, a strong leader who might be living in their own neighborhood, maybe a next door neighbor, and then loyalty shift from the party, maybe to issues, maybe to personalities, and it can even be a combination of these factors, which is very difficult to predict from the outset.
When we talk about the personality-driven parties and all of that, isn't it a more short-term issue as opposed to when a party has got certain structures in place? Dr. Hudson-Buck?
Well, I would agree with that, absolutely. Personalities have to transform themselves into organized parties in order to survive more than one or two elections. And we've seen small parties suffer dramatic losses in previous elections, where they just haven't been able to create a succession plan, where they haven't been able to go beyond a personality to lay out a policy. So where I think these personalities might gain some traction at a local level, it remains to be seen whether they in fact hold that space. And I would argue to some extent all political parties are driven by the personalities at the top. But there has to be something more. And the voter will look for that. They will look for a plan, they will look for policies, and they will look to understand whose interests that political party represents. But I would agree that there is huge scope in South African politics for personality-led, sort of opportunistic politics. But as I said, whether they survive the duration is a different story. And we've seen in the past that voters tend to disagree with those types of personality parties.
One of the things, if I can just quickly point to this map. This is obviously a map indicating how the 2011 local government elections went. All the blue areas, that's where the Democratic Alliance was quite strong. The green areas are where the ANC won. And then there's this anomaly in Kanaland. This is where a small party called ICOSA actually won. And are we likely to see, Dr. Ndev, are we likely to see another small party win like ICOSA in these elections? For instance, maybe based on the issues that we've seen play itself out in Oudtshoorn, are we then likely to see maybe ICOSA gaining some traction within Oudtshoorn?
One of the things that we are certain about is that ICOSA has moved to the southern region, actually has moved to more than one municipality. As to whether they make the impact that they've made in Kanaland, I'm not sure. But in Prince Albert, it's very clear that the other party, the Karoo Progressive Party or something like that, yes, that party has actually made significant inroads purely on raising issues that are pertinent to people within that community. So you are likely, if ICOSA raise issues that are pertinent to the people within those localities, you are likely, people are looking for alternatives that are going to provide services. And we are seeing more and more people are moving away from the party loyalty. But they are more saying, especially at local government, they're more saying, I must look after my interests, and my interests are that I must get service delivery. And if I go back to the issue of leadership, of personalities, we have seen in these elections that political parties, all of them actually, have moved to identify mayoral candidates before the elections, which in some of them it was not traditionally, because they realized that a bigger component of the people's burden or weight or value in terms of deciding would be on who is actually going to take over. And they no longer willing to wait until after elections to see who is going to take over.
One of the very key things then that those candidates, once elected, when they come in, they have to then deal with issues of service delivery. How big a challenge is that going to be, if I can go to you, Dr. Hartenberg? Issues of service delivery and how much they will matter, how much they will sway voters.
Well, I think service delivery is probably one of the prime, if not the main concern of voters today. Of course, party identification matters. The loyalty we hold towards a particular political party over the years will play a huge factor, but I think many voters, many millions of voters will go to the polls tomorrow with service delivery in mind. And service delivery is a very broad term, and it will be about the issues that affect their particular communities, whether it's education, whether it's refuse removal, whether it's water, connectivity. The point is people really want to know whether they can trust the political party or candidate or independent that they will put their mark to in order to be able to leverage state resources to fix problems. And to a large extent, people have understood that the ANC is best placed to do that in the context of South African politics. But increasingly, that may become less so the case, as people look at independents who have been able to challenge the political party who's particularly dominant in a region to be able to rule effectively. We can recall an association in Limpopo who's actually run a particular municipality in coalition with another small party for some years now. And they've continue to garner support from their local residents because they've been able to deliver Bookbuck Ridge. In Limpopo. Now, they've been able to deliver and convince voters for a second term. It's going to be interesting to see whether that particular community-led political organisation is able to continue playing a vital role in that council there, but particularly because they seem to be able to meet service delivery demands.
You know, if I can follow up on what Coletta said here, party politics in local government elections in South Africa is a relatively recent phenomenon. It only started in the middle 80s, and it started under very interesting circumstances. It was when the white minority government was still in control, and the Conservative Party split off from the ruling National Party at the time. And the Conservative Party then, in order to gain votes in elections, started to mobilize at local government level. Now, before that time, there were only independent voters. Some supported independent candidates. Some supported by action groups, by taxpayers and ratepayers associations. But the moment when one party started to mobilize, the other parties automatically had to follow, because they were putting resources into an election that no independent candidate really can match. And that led to an explosion of party domination, national issue domination at local government level. But there's a backlash now. We can see that in terms of the resistance both within the ANC and the Democratic Alliance against the nomination lists of people they allege are imposed on them from the top. And this might be one interesting explanation of the ballooning now of independent candidates as a protest action against the attempts by the national parties to dominate local issues.
We do, sorry not to cut you short, Doctor. Let me just bring in there is a new kid that will be contesting these local government elections, and they already have a national base, the EFF. How much of a player are they likely to be in these elections? Considering that to a very large extent, when they came in, they shook things up. Can I start with you, Doctor?
I think the biggest challenge with them is that they don't understand local issues, and they pitch everything broadly on nationally. And I think that doesn't resonate with some of the communities, because in these elections, people want things to be localized. They want to hear what you're going to do in my street, in my area, in my town. So they pretty much not going to make a huge difference or impact and not grow like widely. But what I think they will also do is that they eat up on all those dissatisfied voters from especially the ruling party. They would find a home in the EFF, but I don't see them winning any municipalities on their own.
Is that a sentiment you shared, Prof?
Yes, I agree with that, but one must also put it in another context. There is another potentially powerful kid on the block, which is the United Front.
Yes.
The United Front has the support of the aggrieved individuals in Cosatu when Cosatu split off under Zwelinzima Babi's direction. And the UF might surprise us, especially in the Eastern Cape, where it could be one of the kingmakers in the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan Municipality. But it might also garner interesting levels of support in other places.
How are they likely to fare, if I may, Dr. Attenberg? How is the EFF likely to fare? You know, Dr. Ndevu says the impact on the ground with these elections won't be as much as what we've seen. What do you think?
Well, I think there are two constraints the EFF face. One is it's a new party, and any new party has a limited budget to go out and campaign. Their reach into local constituencies is very limited. They've spent much of their energy as a result of that, focusing on urban areas and around the Marikana area and so on. So the EFF, if it's smart, will focus its energies on securing local councillors where it previously received support. And that's what I certainly expect to see late tomorrow night. Is, you know, the red sort of showing up on the map where it previously garnered support, and to try and consolidate that, but now at a local level. The other major constraint that the EFF faces is that it does appeal strongly, and the data shows us. Citizen surveys have done a recent survey across the country, representative, and showing us that young people, or at least the EFF, attract much of its support from young people. But on the other hand, we also know that in fact this is the group, the age group, that are least registered. So the EFF are targeting an audience or a constituency that is not registered to vote tomorrow. And that will be one of its major barriers to really pulling support.
Well, that on the one hand, but on the other hand also the organizational capacity of the parties to bring their supporters to the polling booths is going to be crucial.
Prof, if I may, one of the things that we've also seen in the lead up to tomorrow's poll is a number of polls, essentially, and surveys saying, look, the ANC might struggle, particularly in the Western Cape, where the Democratic Alliance has pretty much kind of, in 2011, they came out, they won outright in the Metro. So it's got a very, very good base, the Democratic Alliance. How will the ANC then get to deal with firstly, the Western Cape, and then secondly, in the Eastern Cape, particularly now that the Nelson Mandela Metro is also under threat? Can I start with you, Prof?
The ANC is going to struggle, given its internal factions, struggle to get its logistics in place. I think it has struggled up to now to really project an image of a united party to attract potential voters. And we've already seen cases where the launch of the election campaign here in Khayelitsha did not draw the expected numbers that they had foreseen. Later on now, over the last few days, it has improved. But my suspicion is that they really are having to spend so much energy on trying to project a united front that they do not have the time and energy to really maximize their lobbying amongst their own voters. So I expect them to really lose a lot of support in this election. Whether they're going to, in the end, recover is another question.
All right. Prof, sorry, Dr. Ndevu, let me then bring you in here. Let's once again look at this map to a very large extent. So based on what Prof is saying, yes, this picture might look very differently after the elections. You agree?
Not totally agree. They have some strongholds, like Beaufort West, for example, because of the strong candidate that they have as a mayoral candidate. And because of that candidate, they might retain Beaufort West easily, for example. So there are a number of other municipalities there that they might, Bito, for example, they would retain it. In fact, what I think the mistake that they did, the ANC, was to focus on their constituencies instead of broadening their campaign, to focus on constituencies that they've actually not won before. And that's the biggest challenge, because you are consolidating where other parties are actually also coming in, trying to get voters from. So if, for example, Khayelitsha, the point that was raised around Khayelitsha, you are consolidating where you have actually the support, the necessary support. So I don't think in terms of the upper echelon there in your picture will change much, but Swellendam might change again. Like we have seen, the DA might run in a collision. Hesekwa as well. you might find that the smaller parties and they would have collusions, and the ANC would not run those municipalities.
Can I say actually on that,
yes, ma'am.
the fact that the ANC are trying to consolidate its existing constituency speaks volumes about the fact that it's on the back foot in this province.
Sure.
And to save face, really, the party's now looking just to hold on to the support that it garnered in the last 2011 election. Because another loss of a municipality won't show well for the ANC within the province. So I think it really is trying to do exactly that, consolidate its groundswell of support that it does have. And maybe a second point that I think is crucial in highly contested councils in provinces.
Let's talk specifically of the city of Cape Town.
Let's talk about the city of Cape Town. That's a perfect example. There you have partisan blocks, if you like, that are numerically very similar. The ANC, the DA, and so on. So what you really have on the day is a question of turnout. Turnout's going to matter enormously in Nelson Mandela Bay Metro and in the city of Cape Town, as well as Joburg, and the weather will influence that. Logistics will influence that. Because the more turnout we have for one partisan bloc, by default, it hammers the other side. The mathematics of turnout will determine, to a large extent, who wins or loses tomorrow.
Sorry, sir. Talking about voter turnout, can we include apathy in that discussion? Are we likely to see voter apathy?
That is an interesting factor. And there's lots of contestation around that. Apathy tends to kick in, from my experience, basically in two situations. When everything goes very well, and when there are no real issues, where people have other interests, and where the election results really are not very contested, it will be business as usual after the elections. That is one situation. We don't have that situation in South Africa at the moment. The second one is where the voters are so conflicted in themselves that they really can't decide whether to vote for this candidate or that one, or for this party or that one. For example, they might be aggrieved about the lack of services that they get from the ANC, but they can't get them so far as to vote for the DA. Therefore, the soft option would be just to stay away. Stay away and not take a stand. My suspicion is that we might not see a lot of apathy in these elections tomorrow, because there are alternatives for them. If they don't like the ANC, they can go to the EFF. They can go to the United Front. The other voters that might support the DA, if they don't like a DA candidate, they might go for the Vryheidsfront Front Plus, maybe. So I don't think apathy is going to be an important factor here.
All right. So I would imagine, I'm going to come to you now, Doug. I would imagine then, Dr. Atzenberg, that that's a very good thing for our democracy and going forward, considering, we spoke about the EFF and them bringing in or appealing to a much younger audience. If there isn't much voter apathy, that's a good thing for our democracy.
I couldn't agree more. The quality of a democracy is often judged on the amount of participation it attracts at the polls. And what we saw in the first 10, 15 years of South African democracy is a decline, a very clear decline at the polls amongst the larger eligible electorate, and amongst registered voters. And then suddenly in 2009, as new parties come onto the scene, Congress of the People, later the EFF, the DA sort of rebranding itself as a much more inclusive party, we see a resurgence of turnout.
Because they've got more choices.
Because there's choice, suddenly. I wouldn't go so far as to say that voters who are perhaps dissatisfied with the ANC are convinced that there are other choices. That remains to be seen. I think it's the biggest test that we face tomorrow, whether these opposition parties have been able to be convincing alternatives. I'm not convinced they are yet. But if we see more turnouts tomorrow than in the previous election, which was actually a rise from previous local elections, that is great news for democracy.
So, shall we, Dr. Niv, shall we then preemptively term tomorrow's elections or this week's elections as watershed in our country?
Yes, they will definitely be. They will change the course of how people think about election itself, because many of the people want to make their mark, want their voice to be heard. And they have tried engaging in different structures, and their voice has actually not been heard. And this is an opportunity for them to actually put their voice to be heard. So I think they would. Even bigger parties have gone as far as making sure that they at least encourage voters to go to the voting station and take a decision there. So there's definitely going to be a change in what we do things in South Africa.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we seem to be running out of time. I mean, we had 30 minutes, but that's how quickly it goes. I want to thank you all for coming and for being part of this discussion. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope that our analysts were able to help give you some perspective on these elections and why it's important that you cast your vote. Thanks for sharing in this important and historic moment with us. From me and the team, it's goodbye.
Excellent. Great. Yeah, interesting.
I was very happy.